This explainer examines structural determinants of leadership execution failure and summarizes the research framing, boundary conditions, and research observed implications. Our analysis is organized into 5 main sections. We'll start with the systemic definition, then move to the physiological framing. After that, we'll cover the diagnostic constructs, look at the modeled implications, and finish with the research anchors. So let's begin with Section 1, the systemic definition. This is where we clarify the what of execution failure by really defining the core concept at the heart of this analysis.
The inquiry identifies a primary condition called execution drift. This is a research construct, and what it describes is the predictable way the gap between a strategy and actual behavior widens over time. What's crucial here is that it frames execution failure as a systemic problem, not just a local or individual one.
This systemic disconnect is really well illustrated by what the research calls the training paradox. It gets right to that fundamental gap between knowing something and actually doing it. So the paradox highlights this gap between 2 very different phases. On one hand, you have the initial acquisition of information, learning the strategy. On the other, you have the long-term persistence of that behavior. And what data from places like Xerox and the Harvard Business Review shows is that as real-world pressure gets more intense, the ability to apply that learned behavior deteriorates, and it does so predictably. Okay, so that leads us directly into Section 2, the physiological framing. If the what is execution drift, this next section explains the how, the biological mechanics that are actually driving it. Within this research, behavioral drift gets reframed. It's not seen as a motivational failure, but as a physiological reflex. Our biological systems are simply hardwired to conserve energy and handle threats. They aren't designed to maintain abstract organizational standards, and that priority clash leads to predictable execution decay. The neurobiological sequence is pretty clear. First, as pressure builds, cortisol levels rise, which impairs the function of the prefrontal cortex. That, in turn, dials down our executive function. And what happens then? The individual defaults to a more reactive state, governed by automatic System 1 responses. And this shift is really all about metabolic cost. Deliberate System 2 thinking is just incredibly resource-intensive for the brain. System 1, on the other hand, with its automatic shortcuts, is designed to conserve energy. So under pressure, it's just natural for the brain to default to the less costly state. This phenomenon actually has a name: cognitive miserliness. It means that to conserve its limited mental resources, the brain will discard complex tasks like adhering to a standard and instead favor less intensive processes. This shift from deliberate to automatic is a primary driver of execution failure at a structural level. All right, so knowing what execution decay is and how it works physiologically brings us to the next step: identifying it. Section 3 introduces the diagnostic constructs that are used to categorize the specific behaviors tied to this decay. The main tool here is the phone framework. It's best to think of it as a descriptive research lens. It isn't prescriptive. Its job is to help categorize the specific behavioral variables that consistently accelerate the decay of execution. The F in phone stands for fear-driven risk aversion. This describes that tendency to avoid accountability and put off decisions. It happens when someone perceives the personal or social risk of taking action as being higher than the risk of doing nothing. Next up, the O represents overconfidence and cognitive bias. You can think of this as the Dunning-Kruger effect in action. It's an unaware deviation from standards where leaders overestimate their own effectiveness and in doing so introduce variance into the execution path. Then we have N, which stands for negative impression management. This is what happens when visibility and perceived competence become more important than actual effectiveness. Critically, energy gets diverted away from execution and is instead spent on maintaining a positive image. And finally, E is for execution blindness. This is the inability to see performance gaps even when objective data is right there. It's often a result of information overload, which just limits the brain's capacity to process all the available data. Now, when these phone factors all start interacting with each other, they can create a systemic condition that the research calls decision whiplash. This is where an organization is seen to swing back and forth between 2 extremes: complete decision paralysis on one side and then sudden bursts of impulsive, unstructured action on the other. Understanding these behaviors leads us to the critical risks they create. So Section 4 is all about the modeled implications and the research-observed risks that come directly from these structural problems. The first risk signal is something called metric stagnation. A great example of this is the common plateau in first call resolution rates, right around 70 to 75%.
This isn't just a number, it's analyzed as a clear indicator that the current organizational infrastructure has hit its absolute limit for managing human variability.
The second major risk is AI amplification. Artificial intelligence doesn't fix broken systems. It's a powerful multiplier of whatever conditions already exist. So if you introduce ungoverned AI into a system that's already experiencing execution drift, you will only amplify and scale up those existing inconsistencies.
Both of these risks point to the central finding here. The research makes it exceptionally clear. Execution integrity does not maintain itself. As the findings state, execution does not hold itself together. Systems do. Without those supporting structures, execution will predictably fail.
And that brings us to our final section, which covers the foundational research citations for this analysis.
Research anchors. DOAI 10.5281/Zenodo.1739416. DOAI 10.5281/Zenodo.174255566. ORCID 0009-0004-6525-5634.
Published by the Leadership Execution Institute.